All right, so I know that pastors aren't supposed to say this kind of stuff, but I do not like this story. As a lifelong Martha, I can say that this story makes me feel personally attacked, vilified even. Where are my fellow Marthas out there? The ones who have always had to do the lion's share of the work in any group project, or who literally can be found in the kitchen doing dishes while hosting a party. Can I get an amen? Amen. To all of you, working away in church kitchens, setting up tables, carrying chairs, to all of you unsung heroes of church potlucks everywhere, I see you, and your efforts have worth and value regardless of how this gospel story might make you feel. Whenever I read this story, I'm reminded of when I used to work at the golf course in Half Moon Bay. We had this spot where guests were supposed to stop after their round so that we could, clean their clubs, air hose the grass off their shoes, and hopefully be tipped for our efforts. But not everyone did that. Some of them would drive past us up into the parking lot. Now, sometimes that meant that they didn't want to be helped, or more accurately, didn't want to have to tip us. But other times, it was just that they didn't realize that we wanted them to stop. Regardless of the reason, the majority of my coworkers weren't exactly eager to chase someone down once they had driven past us. But I found that sometimes dedication and persistence would pay off. Plus, if you started to clean their clubs before they could tell you no thank you, they would often feel obligated to give you a tip. Look at me spilling all these insider trade secrets. I cannot tell you the number of times that I walked past my coworkers who were usually just goofing off as I went up into the parking lot to chase down yet another customer, thinking to myself, I'm going to have to split all the tips that I make with those clowns. Or the number of times that I came out from the back of the cart barn, shoes and cuffs of my pants soaking wet, covered in grass clippings after washing a batch of carts, to find those same coworkers just standing around, not helping any guests, leaving carts full of trash for me to deal with. Now, of course, I'm not still bitter or resentful all these years later. That would be ridiculous and also completely understandable. But no, I am totally over it. I simply bring it up to say that I feel for Martha's situation. And I know what it's like to be the one working your butt off while someone else is just sitting on theirs. But to be fair, that's not an entirely legitimate assessment of this story. You can't really equate Mary's decision to sit at Jesus' feet with the laziness of my coworkers. And whenever a story hits this close to home, I've begrudgingly begun to realize that, there's probably something to whatever Jesus is getting at. Our story for today starts with Jesus reinforcing his position as a feminist, something I think that we all should strive to be. I'm sure that he no doubt shocked the disciples when he stated that Martha's place was not, in fact, in the kitchen, but instead seated among the men, learning, discussing, debating, theologizing. It was pretty revolutionary stuff. But it's also important to point out that Martha's actions weren't expected of her just because she was a woman. They would have been expected of anyone hosting a group of people in their home. Hospitality was incredibly important in that day and age. They lived in an arid and barren region, and to refuse to welcome a traveler in that kind of climate would have essentially been a death sentence. The Old Testament is littered with stories of prophets and other travelers who were often angels in disguise being welcomed into the homes or camps of those they encountered along the road. The hosts, on some occasions, having to practically insist that the person accept their hospitality, because there could be dire consequences not just if you were denied hospitality, but also if you were the one who did the denying. Case in point, if you look at the story carefully, you'll find that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah didn't have anything to do with the sexuality of the residents, but instead happened because they violated the hospitality codes of that day and age. So suffice it to say, hospitality was really important to the Jewish people. And given that fact, I don't think that Jesus was trying to say that Martha's efforts were unimportant or that they didn't matter, because they absolutely did matter. Her service reflected Jesus' own commitment to serving others. No, instead, I think that Jesus was just trying to point out that her focus on being a good host had caused her to lose sight of what was truly important in that moment. She got so caught up in the list of things that she had to do, the tasks that she had to accomplish, that she failed to notice the fact that God was both active and present right in front of her, literally sitting in her living room in the person of Jesus. I think that we as humans are almost pre-programmed for busyness, for perpetual and never-ending lists of shoulds and have-tos, or if we're not pre-programmed for it, then the world in which we live and the society that we have created sure do force us into that way of operating. Your value as a person becomes tied to how much you produce, what you're able to accomplish, the number of things that you're able to do. If you're awake, you should be working and contributing something to society. Otherwise, you're just being lazy and a burden to others. We internalize those messages, and they drive us to always be doing more and more. And one of the unexpected blessings of the pandemic was that it brought that obsession with being busy into clear focus. Now, I know it's almost impossible to make any sort of generalization about the pandemic that applies to everyone, since people's experiences of it varied drastically based on occupation, location, and financial situation. But I think it's safe to say that all of us experienced a decrease in busyness in some area of our lives. If not occupationally, then definitely socially. Not being able to go anywhere or see anyone can tend to do that. And I remember how hard it was in the beginning, how uncomfortable it felt, because I was so used to being busy. But as time went on, I actually started to enjoy it. And I can remember that I had the best of intentions of finding a way to hang on to that as we began to emerge from the pandemic. I made a commitment to not return to the tyranny of the to-do list, not to succumb to the busyness that our society boasts as heroic and praiseworthy. And despite my efforts, I was not all that successful. My planner is just as full, if not more so, than it was before the pandemic. I find myself trying to be productive with the tiniest amounts of free time that I have. And worse, I find myself feeling guilty again when I try to take a moment to step away from all that, or when I look back on the day and realize that I didn't accomplish as many tasks as I could have or should have. And that is exactly why Jesus' lesson for today is so important, because he knew that there will always be something else to do, some other project to get to or task to be accomplished. And if we're not careful, we can get lost in, consumed by all those things and lose sight of the things that really matter in this world. We can end up in a situation where we are unable to see Jesus sitting right there in our living room because our vision is so obscured by the stack of dirty dishes sitting in the sink. So, how do we make sure that that doesn't happen for us? Well, for starters, we can do our best to become more intentional about taking time to pay attention to what God is doing in our lives. Take on a practice like meditation or Tai Chi or mindfulness, something that helps you slow things down, and use that time to listen for God's voice. I recently met with my new spiritual director, and if you know me, it won't surprise you to hear that I had to use the restroom twice during our 1-hour meeting. On both occasions, when I returned, I found her standing in the open doorway, looking outside at the flowers and the butterflies in the yard. There was this palpable sense of peaceful serenity that just filled the space. Now, if that had been me, I absolutely would have been on my phone, using that unexpected free time to check my emails or respond to text messages, but not her. She chose instead to spend that time, those few minutes, basking in the sunshine, feeling its warmth and attending to the beauty of God's creation. By most societal standards, her use of time was incredibly inefficient. But as far as nurturing her relationship with God, it was of infinite value. And as you see, it doesn't have to be this huge commitment of time or energy either. I read an article a few years ago by an overworked mother of 3. Although I suppose saying overworked and mother of 3 is a little redundant. But anyway, she was talking about how tired she was of getting advice on how to nourish herself spiritually that always called for her to add something into her already overcrowded schedule. Because she didn't need to wake up 10 minutes early every morning so that she could meditate. What she needed was that 10 extra minutes of sleep. Clearing her schedule to make time for silence and reflection wasn't really an option for her with 3 kids under the age of 7. And she came to this fantastic conclusion that God is as equally present in the chaos and noise of her life as in the silence and tranquility of someone else's life. So to all of you who are overworked, overextended, overexhausted, hearing me, ironically, add to your to-do list with all this talk of ignoring and getting away from to-do lists, have no fear. Because attending to the divine in your life doesn't mean that you have to suddenly find time to go do yoga on a stand-up paddleboard in the lagoon or drive up to the top of Palomar Mountain once a day. Attending to the divine can simply be a matter of intentionality in the midst of the craziness of your everyday life. While Alyssa and I were on our honeymoon, we had so many details to keep track of, so much to plan and prepare for with each next step of the trip that when we arrived at one of our destinations, it was all too easy for our brains to continue on in task completion mode. So Alyssa had us start taking mental pictures in addition to the digital ones. We would purposefully take a second and focus on the moment at hand, to be mindful of what was around us, what we were experiencing. To help us with that, we would literally say, click, click, as if we were taking a picture. And it took just a few seconds. It didn't eliminate the list of things that we needed to pay attention to and accomplish. It simply stopped those lists from carrying us away like a rushing river. And sometimes just that momentary change in perspective is all that you need. To find one moment, one thing of beauty to focus on in the midst of whatever chaos or stress or busyness that's going on around you. Sometimes that's all it takes. Because God isn't trying to turn us into a bunch of lazy slackers who let the dishes pile up while we lounge about, hanging out and talking with our friends. Sadly, Jesus told me I didn't have to is not a valid excuse for not doing your chores. That's not the point at all. This story is about making sure that we don't get so carried away when it comes to our natural inclination for busyness that we lose sight of the ways that God is active and present in our lives. So preoccupied with our to-do lists that we can't hear when God is calling us into a different way of being in the world. So whether you can afford to rework your schedule and begin a daily meditation practice, or whether you simply need to take a 3-second mindfulness pause, do what you need to so that you don't miss it when Jesus sits down in your living room. Amen.